Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Ed West, the author of The Wrong Side of History Substack and of many books, including The Diversity Illusion, What We Got Wrong About Immigration and How to Set It Right, and Tory Boy, Memoirs of the Last Conservative. We spoke today about Rotherham. I think everyone listening will know what I mean when I use the word Rotherham. I wrote an essay about it this week, including the vexed issue of what words to use to describe this atrocity. It's currently back in the news cycle, largely thanks to the intervention of Elon Musk. And Ed and I have both been writing about Rotherham for years now, and we spoke about why it is that it's now suddenly receiving all this attention, why it happened, whether or not it has the capacity to bring down the government, and what next? What is the future of multicultural Britain? How do we cope with something like this? The extended version of the episode is available, as always, at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can find the writing I put on Substack, including this recent essay on Rotherham, the chat community, which is booming, and the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and all the back catalogue of old episodes, including the last time Ed was on the show last year. Ed, I think that probably the main thing that we're going to end up talking about today is Rotherham.
Right, I suspected so.
Yes, it's this quite weird feeling, which I've had this week, and I imagine you did too, of a long-standing concern that almost no one cared about, outside of like sections of the British right wing, all of a sudden becoming a focus of international outrage after decades. It's a very strange feeling.
Yeah, it's a strange mechanism, isn't it? How
Yeah.
a story can just be there, and all of a sudden, just because I think a couple of tweets, really, and then Elon Musk noticed it. I think it was Max Tempers. I don't know who he is, but he writes.
I assume that's a pseudonym.
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
And he just happened to find court excerpts from one of the cases, I think in Oxford, which was particularly gruesome.
Which I think the sentencing remarks had been publicly available.
Yeah, that's the thing. All these things were
time.
available, right? It just takes a few people to dig them out and sort of
I saw some suggestions that maybe they'd been only belatedly released, but I don't see why that would have happened.
I don't think so. I mean, as far as I know, court reports are there, but they're not all published. But I mean, they exist somewhere, so I don't really know the details, to be honest. But it was basically that, and I think it was that sort of argument between Sam Bidwell and Fraser Nelson about the benefits of diversity, multiculturalism. And then Elon picks up on it, and yeah, as you say, obviously, I think I would love to see polling on how many people are aware of what was going on, because I think most people were aware that there had been sexual abuse. I think probably most people didn't realize it was in over 50 cities, and that was so widespread in the numbers. When I first heard about it, I mean, when did most people hear about it? It was probably the Andrew Norfolk reporting. I just didn't. Actually, I'd heard about it before because Nick Griffin had talked about it, but I didn't believe it. I mean, it sounds. If you started talking about it, you just sound like a complete crazy.
Yeah.
Right wing. I mean, it's like a blood libel. You know, the Charlene Downs case, who was murdered and they think turned into kebab meat. I mean, it's like a blood libel, but the blood libel is true, right? And it goes beyond anything, we could imagine. So, of course, you're going to sound a bit crazy if you even entertain the prospect. And I guess there's a lot of the rage on Twitter now, which feels something like 2020 in reverse, but like the right wing in control. Is a lot to do with class, and there is there's an anger that like people like us just obviously wouldn't have any kind of inkling of what's happening, and they'd have no connection to the kind of the type of person who's victimized here, which is totally true. I mean, I would just have no day-to-day contact with them, and a vague kind of awareness that children in care, girls in care, are obviously far more likely to have it, every bad thing happen to them. And this is just a sort of, I suppose in most cases, like you say, an underclass who most of us just don't sort of think about, and just hope that social services do their best to kind of minimize the misery. But obviously that didn't happen, and a lot of things were obviously allowed to go on because of sensitivities about race. I mean, it comes up in so many cases, and obviously the abusers themselves were obviously motivated by a kind of particular kind of desire to conquer white women and a kind of racial animus to them. I mean, you've written about this recently, but there is that racial, sexual element. So now there is a sort of belated horror of what happened, and and it's kind of blown up as a story. And as we
Yeah.
speak, it's got to be debated in Parliament, and there might be an inquiry and all sorts.
And I think it's filtering out. I agree with you about polling. I just, from speaking to friends and family, I think that what was quite a common view, and probably remains a common view among lots of people who aren't very online, is that they knew that about Rotherham and maybe a couple of other places like Rochdale and Telford. But I think there was kind of an assumption that it was almost like statutory rape. It
Right,
was like girls who, yes, were underage and were being seduced by older
right.
Muslim boyfriends.
14-year-old girls and 19-year-old boyfriends, kind of,
Yeah, and maybe there was drugs and,
yeah,
like it was all kind of dodgy, but it wasn't at all like what the transcript that the sentencing remarks that Elon alighted on represent,
right,
and what cranks like us knew about for years, like, yes, what happened to Charlie Downs, and, you know, girls kept in dog cages, girls branded, all this kind of sexual torture stuff. I
yeah. And
think
obviously,
that,
a lot of them died either through sort of manslaughter, murder, or the inevitable drug addictions that follow.
yeah, I was reading some of the comments on the Spectator, and obviously, Spectator readership are going to be politically engaged and right leaning, and even then, people were saying like, "I had no idea anyone was murdered. I had no idea that it was happened in so many places." I think there was like a partial knowledge, but very, very partial,
Yeah,
and I suspect that's what polling would probably show if you had a sophisticated enough poll.
yeah. I would love to, because a lot of journalism is like one, questioning what does the average person think, and we don't know because we spend a lot of time either talking to other politically obsessed freaks,
Yeah,
and we will probably have a few sort of upper normie friends in real life who are kind of give us the other side, but I don't know how much breaks through. And also, you've got to understand is that most people, when they, most people, a lot of people, including myself, when they see reports about sexual abuse, just don't read it because I don't want to know.
you're like, gross, don't want to hear about that. Yeah.
But I don't know. It's hard. I get the impression there is a sort of cultural shift as a result in this, in the sense that our kind of collective memory will be now changed a little bit. This
Mm,
will deeply go into the memory. I mean, I would think about, we associate the early Victorian period with workhouses, even though that was sort of one aspect of it, and it was actually more complicated than that. And actually, rural life was actually poorer, and some places the workhouses actually improved people's lives. But because of the effect of Dickens and to less extent Marx, that is what we think. And I just wonder if now people's idea of kind of these kind of bicultural northern cities in the late 20th century will now be just, this was England at the time, like grooming gangs, girls getting abused,
yeah.
which was, yeah. I still like the figures. I still don't, because whenever I read the figures, someone say, well, these are the figures and these are established by court, and they just seem so outlandishly large that, again, if you had just made this up, said thousands, like, I know Elon has exaggerated a little bit, but we are talking, I think, high five figures or six figures, and it just
Yeah.
seems so unfathomably large that.
Although it's over such a long period,
Right,
I was speaking to, so a weird kind of phenomenon here, although whether or not this proves to be true, is that London does not seem to have been as affected, which
right,
may be one factor in why upper normies don't know about it. Because even if it were working class girls, it's partly, I suppose, there aren't really any white working class people left in London. That's another conversation. But even if it were working class girls or underclass girls in London who'd been victimised, upper normies in London would eventually have heard about it,
yeah,
someone's
oh yeah,
cleaner's daughter kind of link. Whereas the fact that actually London has been unexpectedly excluded from this for reasons I can't quite fathom, it seems to be obviously northern places like Rotherham, but also, well, Oxford, I suppose, is an outlier there because Oxford is very posh in some sections. But anyway, for some reason, like the social connections are just absent, right?
yeah,
Between the sort of people, which includes us, who generally work in media, and the girls who are victimised in this case. But then I was speaking to a friend who grew up in Banbury, which definitely had a grooming gang and has had convictions of quite a lot of men. I'm sure a tiny fraction of the actual number of perpetrators. And she says that she remembers in the early noughties girls in her year who definitely had like quote unquote older Asian boyfriends.
Right.
And even if it was only like, 2% of a school year, if it's every year for 30 years, you can easily,
Yeah, the numbers add
in
up.
one quite small town, you can easily see how the numbers can get really large.
Yeah, I mean, the London anomaly is kind of interesting. I wonder, I guess it could be to do with just the demographic difference of London is not, there are just so many different groups. No one's really that dominant in any particular area. I mean,
Maybe.
I mean, these grim gangs do tend to be Pakistani origin, and Pakistani population in London's pretty small.
Yeah, that might be it. I'm not. I think there have been some. There have definitely been some Somali men involved
In Bristol, right? Yeah.
in Bristol, and there are quite a lot of Somalis in London.
It's hard to know what actually goes on. I mean, I'm sure, I think in terms of actual overall sex crime, London is on the higher end. So, I mean, it depends.
Yeah,
I wonder if more and more stuff is going to come out as the kind of Overton window shifts on this, and people are going to, open new things. Well, there are
yeah,
these other kind of
probably.
things that have been going on, which we haven't talked about for culturally sensitive reasons, and they're not just Pakistanis. But I think that may be coming down the line. Who knows?
Well, incredible timing of it was the top story in the Telegraph yesterday, and it's been in the Times and so on about foreign nationals being 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences than British nationals,
I don't think it was age adjusted. I might be wrong on that, but
which would slightly exaggerate probably the foreign
yeah,
share.
because obviously most immigrants are in
Are
their
younger.
20s, and most crime is committed by men between age and 18 and 24. But
Yeah,
I mean, right on the countries which do like stats on this are mainly Denmark, and I think some of the other Scandinavian countries have started doing it. And obviously there are huge disparities in violent crime between different nationalities, and there are huge disparities in sex crime. And again, we're just sort of, expected to ignore this when it obviously has a huge impact on everyday life. I mean, in fairness, if from what I see, that British crime rates, British Pakistanis are not especially. I mean, I think their average crime level is slightly over the national average, but very, very close to the average. Not actually that high.
Noah Carl did a deep dive into
Right? Yeah.
this for Aporia, and yeah, it seems that actually in general he was looking at Muslims, and because that was sort of a specific claim that he was
Yeah.
engaging with, that Muslims are more criminal, and it seems that actually that's not really true on average. What might be going on is it's specific types of sex offences where there's a massive overrepresentation, but actually in all other areas of crime, not really.
Yeah, I think this particularly, the grooming gang is a particular type of. I mean, there's some people trying to, water over. There are white paedophile gangs, rings. Of course, there are paedophile rings everywhere, but paedophile rings
Yeah,
tend to be
image
kind of
based.
on internet-based kind of group of people with
Yeah,
very extreme kind of sexual tastes meeting each other randomly, and when the grooming case gangs were people who had known each other and sometimes family members and kind of members of the same clan
yeah,
who within that kind of cultural framework considered it kind of normal. So let's go and basically abuse this girl, and that's what people find so hard to take, because obviously in everyday life, if you said that to your family member or friends, they would say like, have you
yeah,
been hit on the head or something. So it is obviously particularly related to the clannishness
yeah.
of these populations who are otherwise quite law abiding, not particularly criminal. I think in the case, like, obviously from Danish and other stats, I say like in the case of Somalis, they are quite overrepresentative
In all
amongst.
kinds of crime, pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
not yet at the paywall, are we? Right, but
No, but you know what, Ed? I think this is like, yeah. I think we should. I think that being squeamish about true things is exactly why we've got to this stage.
right,
And I think that probably tolerance for that squeamishness is rapidly falling away,
yeah,
which is also is very interesting, right? The question of why this is now suddenly making headlines when this is all decades old, it is to do with Elon
yeah,
having chosen to boost it and having bought Twitter, and therefore Twitter having Twitter has ended up with a more right wing bias, I think, only because old Twitter used to censor the right, and now that doesn't
yeah,
happen anymore. But I think also there's a mood in Britain of deep distrust of authorities, which has partly come out of Southport.
yeah.
it wasn't so very long ago that revelations about what Ruda Cabana had also been charged with, in terms of being charged with terrorist offences, dealt a real sort of blow to the government, because the various government officials and news organs like the BBC were very eager to insist, in the wake of the Southport attacks, that there was no link to Islamic terrorism. And then when evidence came to light suggesting that there might have been, obviously the court proceedings are ongoing. And one of the things I think that probably has contributed to Britain being maybe more wary of talking about some of this stuff is our contempt of court laws are particularly strict, and our libel laws are also particularly strict. And I think it's made it harder to talk about. I mean, I've had lots of things cut out of articles written over the years for lots of different media outlets because of fears about legal repercussions.
Were these just ongoing things or sort of post-legal things?
Both.
There is a definite decline in trust amongst the population of the authorities, I think, of the courts and politicians and the media. And I know it gets very kind of, it comes like this right-wing cliche about, we're not trusting the elites, but that definitely came out after the riots and rapidly. And normally you'd think riots, I mean, if you look at polls, not many people sympathize with the rioters. I mean, I think it was like 1 in 5 or something. Most people rightly thought they were kind of like a mixture of kind of, I mean, lots of them had long criminal convictions, and a massive underplayed factor was a lot of them were obviously alcoholics and cocaine addicts.
Yeah.
But there was generally huge mistrust of what the authorities were saying. I think that is the way that people kind of jumped to conclusions and felt suspicious after the attack, was that it had the hallmarks of a terror attack. There was obviously the debate straight away about, this guy was like homegrown, and when it was obviously he was the son of African Rwandan migrants, which played into the idea of like, okay, this is, as soon as someone's sort of second generation, this is nothing to do with immigration. This is all just part of our society. And there was also deep distrust about the way that previous atrocities had obviously been dealt with by the authorities and the media in a way to minimize intercommunal problems. After the Nottingham attack, and he was an African Portuguese immigrant, and he kind of murdered 3 people. 2 of them were very young, and it was horrendous. And straight away there was this kind of a website popped up, which now disappeared, saying Nottingham Together, whatever it's called. And there is this kind of whole don't look back in anger thing about, the community is together. This has nothing to do with diversity. This has nothing to do with immigration, or this has nothing to do with Islam. And often it's not to do with Islam. It's just to do with the kind of stresses and kind of disorder of a kind of multicultural society. And I think that thing can only be used a certain number of times before people get... I noticed as well, I remember the Alkali attack, and all the papers reported, the man from Newcastle, the Newcastle man. It's like, he's not
the
Newcastle
Yazidi
man.
one in Clapham.
He was Afghan. And it's like, why don't you just be honest about the whole thing? This is the result of immigration. And this is in particular a result of immigration having like some very violent outliers.
Yeah.
Which people feel, and I think a lot of people probably maybe exaggerate in their heads as a part of the debate not being so open. And so, after Southport, I think the Southport thing is probably worsened by the fact that many of the kind of online convictions were grossly over the top. And I mean, I say tyrannical. In particular, the case of 2 women who have both gone to jail for, I think, one for 18 months for just tweeting. I think she's tweeted like blow up the mosque, and then, no criminal record.
Was that the wife for the Tory councillor?
The Tory councillor, right.
She didn't even say someone should. It was like, if someone did, I wouldn't care. It was something along those lines. Yeah. Which,
I mean, obviously Britain is America, United States, that obviously wouldn't be I think she should have got a criminal record and like a fine or something. Like sending her to jail is grotesque, and it's
while also emptying prisons, because apparently we have prison overcrowding. Yeah.
And there was, like at the same time, there was in Bristol, there was a Somali man who threw a brick at a crowd. He got off. So I totally agree. There is a 2-tier system, and I think there is a general kind of underlying sense that the system is a kind of against people, and the system doesn't care. And I think Keir Starmer, who's very much like a procedural man, he's kind of weird man with no vision of the country. He doesn't
dreams.
He has no dreams. He's like
it's such a weird thing to admit in an interview.
He has nothing. Yeah, he has no dreams. He has no
Yeah.
novel. He has no. He
Yeah.
has no idea of what he actually wants to do to make Britain better. He's completely like the system, the procedure must continue as much as possible. And part of that system is a kind of legalistic tangle of human rights laws and hate speech laws and all these other kind of things which people really feel are making their lives worse, less
Yeah.
free, less safe. And I suppose, in this atmosphere, Elon Musk making Twitter a complete kind of free speech zone.
Mm.
1,000 kind of flowers bloom. Some of the flowers producing absolute crap. Lots of exaggeration. Elon himself is he retweets some really mad figures, and some of the stuff is kind of wildly exaggerated. So which I feel is like you're giving kind of ammunition to people who say this is misinformation, disinformation, and he's just spreading hate. Because if one side is kind of telling exaggerated versions of what's happening, and the other side just doesn't want to talk about it and feels that any kind of discussion of it is a threat to the system, which is what they feel.
Which it
And
is.
there's kind of little room for a kind of happy middle ground there.
Yeah. And at the moment, I mean, Starmer's, so we're speaking on Tuesday, 7th. Starmer's press conference yesterday, he leant very, very heavily on the idea that it was all kind of Elon having an ego trip and spreading misinformation for his own nefarious ends. I logged on to Mumsnet yesterday to get a taste of like upper normie female discourse.
Is Mumsnet still a good? Because obviously I've never been on it, but
you're allowed.
I mean, allowed.
They won't block your IP address.
Yeah,
you're allowed. It is quite well. The modal Mumsnetter is like quite middle class. It definitely skews middle class, and like a bit older, so like 30 plus. And I mean, Mumsnet has, I keep an eye on it sometimes because Mumsnet is quite a good barometer, I think. And definitely you have been seeing more discussion of, for instance, asylum hotels. And people expressing unhappiness about that, and often directly related to worrying about their children if they've got an asylum hotel near them.
Yeah, quite understandably, really.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of
that's another factor. Yeah. But the last I saw from yesterday, the only discussion of this was to do with Elon Musk's interventions. It wasn't actually like revisiting any of the Rotherham stuff. And the overwhelming view was like, Elon's a weird American billionaire. He should stop being weird. I think Elon is so obviously kind of spurgy.
Yeah.
I personally have very high tolerance for spurgy men, but a lot of women don't. A lot of them find it kind of creepy, off-putting, whatever. So at the moment, that's all that's kind of filtered through to Mumsnet. But that doesn't mean it will stay that way. And because if this continues to be an issue in Parliament, it can't help but dredge up.
Right. I mean, the fact is, from what I've seen in polls, Elon's not particularly popular in Britain. Just as way like Trump isn't particularly popular. But I think turning this into, we're defending liberal British values against this kind of crazed right-wing American outsider, it's just not going to work. And they're obviously kind of already conceding ground and kind of flailing a little bit because everyone knows the scale of the crime, and the more it's talked about, it's horrific. And everyone kind of knows that there is a feeling that the establishment was compromised by it. I mean, the inquiry, if there is a major inquiry, so the kind of comeback is, there's been an inquiry. There's been inquiries about
bits
separate
and
counts.
pieces.
Yeah, and there's been a kind of overall child abuse inquiry, but there wasn't one in particular about this, which is what people are calling for now. The way political discussion works, the kind of rigmarole, which is kind of tiresome a little bit, but that's how, you make something a story and you keep on talking about it and it continues to be a story and then people talk about it more. And it's possible for the government to not get drawn into this. So, if you look at the way that the BBC, for example, been covering this, which is always a good barometer of whether it's kind of accepted discussion, it was just initially, okay, Elon's been saying these things, Elon's been interfering in British politics, and at first it wasn't even discussing what the subject was, and as the week's gone on, I think now the BBC is kind of, this has become the subject. Grooming gangs were being discussed on the Today programme, and it has become the story, which is what I suppose the government didn't want it to be. It's so far out there in terms of kind of the nature of the crime that they just don't want this to be a subject talked about. And Elon's obviously, he controls a massive, tech platform. He can't stop tweeting all the time. I think as we've been on air, he's tweeted again about it. So yeah, it's a story, and the pressure to have a proper inquiry is only going to continue.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. I saw an interesting clip earlier of Sophie Ridge, who's a long-standing Sky News presenter, interviewing a Tory minister maybe. But the thing that I found striking was that she was describing some of the atrocities committed against these girls, and she had tears in her eyes.
Right.
And she's a very, very establishment figure. And it may be that actually a lot of these people in senior positions in the media just didn't know even a fraction of it, and suddenly they've learnt. And I think quite a lot of people are going through a process of shock.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like all atrocities. If you just look at the numbers, it doesn't. The old Stalin line about million is a
Indeed.
If you just read one or two of the actual individual stories, which, as I say, most people probably wouldn't because you just don't want to. But I suppose a lot of people in the media as well, like myself, have teenage daughters. This is like the worst thing that could ever happen anywhere. I definitely, hold to the idea that it has kind of got some cut through now. Again, it's very strange that, someone, I don't know who, I think it was Duncan Rumsden, the economist, who says that most British scandals involve things that everyone has been aware of and have just discovered like a few years later.
Yeah.
And it's all there somewhere. Yeah. You just need a few people with an interest to kind of shine a light in it, and then for important people to pick up. And I suppose, especially with social media, one kind of anonymous account, I don't know, with a couple of thousand followers can tweet something, and then the world's most powerful, richest man takes an interest, and then it kind of blows up. It's huge.
When it's on top of so many other things. I mean, just when we were talking earlier about all the various instances of like immigration-related crime that have been in the papers in recent years, I'd forgotten about some of them. I forgot about the Azadi Alkali attack, for instance, even though it happened near where we were living at the time.
And I think even now, that was just under a year ago, wasn't it?
Maybe longer, but yeah, it's.
I think the response to that now, something like that happening now, would be completely explosive in a way it wouldn't be then. In the same way, after the George Floyd killing, every single confrontation between a black man and the police was just likely to trigger more protests and violence, whatever. And once something becomes a story, then every instance of it becomes more salient. And so now, at the time, remember, I think it was Caroline Noakes, the Tory minister, was on Newsnight talking about how this is misogyny, sort of microaggressions were responsible for this. And
I forgot about that. Yeah,
it's just an absurd, naive idea that okay, you can say there's a spectrum of misogyny and violence. I mean, there's a spectrum of everything, but to compare these kind of very small level kind of anxiety inducing problems that people in the West have with obviously extreme cultures of violence and misogyny which exist in many parts of the world, which many people, I suppose many good liberals, are just kind of incurious about, really. But this kind of sex attacks, this kind of clannishness, this kind of unwillingness to participate in more wider civil society are just completely the norm in lots of places. And, no one has really kind of contemplated, yes, if you have a local authority where 30% of the population come from one particular part of the world and a very large percentage of them come from one particular clan, that's definitely going to affect how politics works in that way. That's going to affect everywhere, every level of society. It's going to affect another issue which hasn't talked about, who, what about the police? What is
Mm.
their role? What is their relationship? If the police become dominated by this kind of clannishness, there's going to be massive corruption risks. And I think now, if any inquiry is going to show that a lot of these councils where this went on, there is some sort of corruption going on.
Yeah, I think that role of the police has been understated, and actually, at least so far in the public discussion, having watched Charlie Peters' documentary and that came out a couple of years ago
Yeah,
and
very
spoken
good
to him
documentary.
about it, yeah, I think that actually the role of clannishness in within the police was very important and makes sense of some of these stories you read, like girls showing up to report on their abusers and then getting a text while they are
Right.
in the police station
Yeah.
saying, "I've got your little sister," to give one example.
That is a very, very telling case. And I think that's the kind of thing
Mm,
in any inquiry that comes up is going to really, really shine a light. Yeah, I mean, the police without fear or favor. We both write and talk about the kind of weirdness of Western society.
mm,
Without fear or favor is a kind of concept you can really only have in very outbred individualistic societies where you have where the power of the clan's been broken. It's
mm.
much more complicated when that is not the case.
If you try to bribe a British police officer, they would look at you in confusion,
Yeah,
right? And that's internationally, that's so unusual. In many countries, that's you're expected to give bribes to police officers.
yeah. I mean, and transparency, International's index will kind of tell, it's kind of, I mean, Northern Europe, Northwest Europe is kind of unusual. I mean, I think the general trend in most of the world is probably quite positive, in that a lot of these kind of cultural practices can be slightly changed with the incentives. But,
Mm,
it is very, very slow change. And, a lot of the problems we're facing is what happens when you have a very outbred, very individualistic society, and you have within that clannish groups brought in.
mm,
And now, being in a member of a clan brings huge advantages, even basic stuff like pooling resources to buy property,
mm-hmm.
but also
Or
things like
visas.
what's that?
Or visas.
Or visas, yeah. So
Mm,
a lot of the issue of immigration is basically to do with chain migration. So you wonder why are you spending £10,000 on a people smuggler to move across the world? Because you're doing it for your family, and the
mm,
idea is when you have citizenship, you will also help your family members get citizenship, and this is completely normal in most parts of the world. You
mm.
are obliged to help other family members. The English are pretty unusual in the sense we don't have strong family, family connections. In most parts of the world, you make it rich, or if you get access to government wealth, your family turn up and expect to have a part of it, right? While an Englishman like wins a lottery and his cousins turn up, it's sort of you press the button saying release the hounds. They're not, it's like
Yeah, I saw someone.
I'm not obliged to help you.
Someone joking on Twitter recently about how every culture claims to like love food and love their grandmothers,
Yeah,
except Northwest Europeans who hate food and hate their grandmothers.
yeah, that is
Yeah,
we're just like can't wait for them to leave before saying
yeah.
that's enough. Yeah, so we are very unusual, and one of the criticisms I make of people is that even people who spend a lot of time traveling around the world, for instance, that kind of class
Mm.
of people, they don't really take that much of an anthropological interest in it. I mean, there's good piece by Chris Bayliss in the Critic recently about this.
Yeah, I read that too. It was very
Just
good.
a complete, and it was in relation to the criticism of Ben Judah's book. So most parts of the world, people are kind of interested in different cultures and different ethnicities and the way they have different characteristics. That used to be about quite an obsession of British travellers who go around the world, and some of them are obviously a bit shady and like to measure heads and stuff. But
Mm.
we've become sort of so polite about that. We kind of pretend it doesn't exist, but it obviously does exist, and it manifests itself in lots of different cultural practices. Some of which are very noble and worth emulating, but some of which manifest themselves in kind of horrors we don't really understand or appreciate.
I think it's Aris Rusinos commenting that maybe anthropology is going to become the new PPE for British
Yeah, I mean,
politicians. I mean,
absolutely.
if only. Because actually, as you say, the problem is actually generally a lack of curiosity and lack of knowledge.
Right. And so everyone will be the same if you just give them this kind of British air. They will start to behave. Obviously, they won't.
Mm.
the people like us problem is like, if you grow up in a upper middle class background in Britain, you will have friends from different backgrounds, but they will be very selected, and
Yeah.
they will tend to be from kind of elites back in the developing world. They will be just as deracinated as we are. They will probably be
Mm.
secular. If they're Muslim, they drink alcohol.
Mm.
These are friends, but and I'm just as guilty as anyone. I mean, I grew up in West London. The Asian friends I had, they were all from the kind of shopkeeper class, and they were the sons of chemists who became doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know there were sort of Asian gangs. That would have been like completely incomprehensible to me until I was well into my teens.
Mm.
And we aren't really aware of lots of the country. And I suppose the counter is, this is a liberal society. We don't all have a duty to find out what everyone else is doing, and everyone should be allowed to sort of do their own thing and live in their own niche. And this was my sort of objection: national service. I don't think people should be forced to hang around people from different backgrounds if they don't want to.
Mm.
The counter is, I mean, this is obviously your big theme, that the sexual revolution had like a different impact on different classes of society, and for the lowest class, who are the poorest, who have things like the least impulse control, it was devastating. And it was
Mm.
devastating, and that was bad enough that you
Mm.
left a kind of large number of young women vulnerable, but at the same time you then bring over people from different cultures who see things in a completely different way,
Mm.
and who often see these kind of white women as sexually available for them. The combination of having a kind of sort of incredibly atomized and decadent Western society with a very clannish religious one is a kind of completely mad combination. You wouldn't design a better society for this kind of thing to go on. It's just toxic, really.
Yeah, and I mean, no one did design it. I don't think. I still, for all of the manifest failures of the British state, I still lean on the side of this being a product of ignorance,
Yeah, definitely.
not a product of malevolence.
No, I don't think anyone ever imagined it would end up like that. And I think, in the overall scheme of things, there are lots of, this is so the Fraser Nelson argument is like Britain is the most successful multicultural society. I mean, I would say in the sense that it's probably the least unsuccessful multicultural society in some ways. It hasn't been, we haven't ended up in civil war. Lots of people get on, lots of people intermarry, lots of people get on perfectly fine. It's just, you just end up with sort of different pockets where, things work fine and it's actually a benefit. And then the other extreme where things are pretty disastrous.
I don't know if it's true that we are the least unsuccessful. I think that, as far as I'm aware, no other country has had anything like our grooming gang scandal. I've heard like suggestions of it happening to some degree in the Netherlands
Right.
and in Finland at one point. And
Yeah.
maybe I wouldn't be surprised if there's been some very bad stuff happening in Germany and France.
Right.
But to my knowledge, nothing at this scale or with this sort of level of ferocity. And it definitely, I don't think this has happened in Canada or Australia or the
Yeah.
other
I mean, I
Anglophone
sort of
countries.
say least successful, but the colonial powers are obviously, the United States has obviously been pretty good at integrating people.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's happened. I mean, it's happened nowhere near on the same scale on the continent, and I don't think.
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know whether that it's because it's kind of mostly a South Asian thing.
yeah. I think, well, an exception to that would be, of course, the sort of Cologne style,
Right.
like mass public attacks, which are also quite common in North Africa.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I've been to North Africa with my then girlfriend, and yeah, it was pretty
Yeah,
good experience, I have to say.
I found traveling in the third world very instructive in
Yeah,
my early 20s.
I think a lot of women go there and see that, and then kind of block it out their minds about
I
whether
think,
that's kind of
yeah, South, the Indian subcontinent is famous for gang rape, right?
yeah,
I think probably what has happened in Britain is it's that long-standing culture combined with Islam, which adds to, because this happens in India as well,
yeah.
but combined with Islam, which gives this condemns outgroup like promiscuity, let's say. So like regards these girls as potentially as being legitimate targets of sexual violence.
Yeah, I think that's quite common across the Middle East, North Africa, and when I remember the
Yeah.
Lonely Planet guide to Tunisia, when, like the third words is like hello, hello, thank you, can I have a coffee? Shame, your mother will know about you, and it's all this is like when you get molested by men.
Oh, that's what you're supposed
Um,
to say.
I mean, yeah, the clone thing. So going back to the data on sex crimes in that the Danes recorded, and those parts of the world are obviously hugely represented, overrepresented.
Mm.
But there's no kind of more sort of semi-organized pattern of it. I mean, I wonder, is this just down to the particular cowardliness of British authorities? I mean, it's something that's slightly troubling.
We are also the only country that doesn't really have a nativist political movement to speak of, a reform being a fledgling one. But
Right.
maybe I'd always thought that was because of first past the post. But it may also be that actually we're less minded in that way.
Yeah, it's the kind of downside. I mean, I think if you look at most measures, like the British are, like the French are, without crude stereotypes, much more racist than the English. Like, and they're
Yeah,
also just kind of more belligerent about even racist towards outsiders from outside the area.
yeah.
And they would just the sort of upside of that is they just wouldn't tolerate this kind of thing in such a way. While Britain has had kind of racial tolerance totally drummed into it. If you may, on the one hand, you have sort of tolerance to interracial relationships, tolerance to neighbours living next door, but obviously the downside is that you have the kind of extreme other end where you have tolerance to things which are obviously bad
Mm.
happening, but you don't want to look like you're kind of condemning it because of who's involved.
Hmm.
So I think there is a bit of that. I don't know, like it's like a pathological variation of a good thing in that sense.
Yeah.
But it's
Well, yeah.
Germany and Holland are kind of quite similar and culturally in Scandinavia. So
They're on track to have. I guess I guess what's happened. So in Sweden, for instance, the problem they now have is with like grenade attacks.
yeah, the Swedish gangs, as they were first called, I remember laughing and thinking that's really funny.
I think what's happened is that each of these European countries has ended up with slightly different groups coming, immigrating to them.
Right,
And then their groups have brought their unique pathologies.
right,
And in general, the native Europeans haven't been very wise to this and haven't responded effectively. And
right.
I mean, kind of to varying degrees. I think that probably what we did is we imported a particular strain of sexual violence from Pakistan, whereas there aren't as many Pakistanis in other parts of Europe. And we also were particularly useless in responding to it.
I mean, one of the things I thread, and I'm writing it right now, is the thread with the late 90s, like the Macpherson report, the inquiry
Mm,
into anti-racism. And I don't think maybe other European countries went so far in adopting that. I mean, it was an idea adopted from the United States and the Black Power movement, and it became very initiated into the British police as a kind of idea.
hmm.
Obviously, if you're a British policeman, you're investigating crimes like this. Uh, is not going to do your career any good to have racism allegations thrown at you, which inevitably would happen if you started
Yeah,
with this. It's
yeah,
career ending, basically. So it's a matter of incentives. It didn't incentivize anyone to look into it in that sense. So I think
yeah.
like just the kind of anti-racism norms that really hardened in the late 90s must have had a big impact.
I've seen quite a few people compare this to Chernobyl
Right.
in the sense of being a disaster. Well, Chernobyl was a one off disaster. This is more of a long, ongoing disaster, which reveals the terrible pathologies in the regime.
Yeah. It's quite a good analogy, isn't it?
I think it is because this does end up sort of being, it's so obviously destabilizing to the key ideological framework of diversity being our strength that I don't really know what the government can do, honestly. I mean, I'm shocked at Keir Starmer doubling down. And did you see that clip as well of a Tory MP, I forget who, I'm sure he has, I think I forget who it was, but a former minister, and therefore is implicated just as much as any other, minister, but responding specifically to Keir Starmer's suggestion that being concerned about this was jumping on a far-right bandwagon. And you had Labour MPs all booing him and shouting, shame, shame, shame. And I think what they're doing is they're suggesting that he's using it, he's being cynical, and they don't believe it. And it's just, but I find it really, it's really appalling to see it through the rest of the world's eyes, and to realise that actually they don't really have any choice but to double down, because this is actually such a problem.
Right. There are two aspects to that. Firstly, yeah, as you say, if you've invested your entire, your moral justification for yourself, what you stand for, is kind of based on this system that diversity is a strength, and you've been doing it your entire life, and you've been saying it, you're not going to just turn around and say, "Whoops."
No.
And on the other hand, there is, they can, in their own consciences, and I'm sure in many cases they're correct. They would say, when people who oppose diversity, dislike multiculturalism, want to make this salient. I have to say, I'm conscious of even tweeting too much about this, because I'm well known as being a kind of opponent of diversity. I've written a book saying I think multiculturalism is a mistake, and I think mass immigration will lead to all sorts of social problems that kind of outweigh the benefits. And so I feel that people might think, well, of course he's going to want to jump on this bandwagon because he wants diversity put on trial, basically.
It should be.
I think it should be. What can I say? I don't know. It is an extreme kind of black mark against the whole system. And you can still believe in the system afterwards. You can still say, well, overall there are so many good points about it. But you can't deny this is one of the things that people are really going to associate with multiculturalism, because there is no counterpoint either. I mean, you can say, oh, yeah, I support that the Iraq war is still a good thing, because, if we hadn't invaded, who knows what happened in the Arab Spring? Could have ended up even worse. You can't say, well, if we hadn't had immigration from Pakistan to Rotherham, what could have happened? It can't have been. You wouldn't have had these mass rapes. I mean,
yeah.
There is no way of justifying it, or even making the system, making it look like it's worth it, as a trade-off. The other counterpoint is say, okay, so what now? What do you want? I mean, what does the right want? People here now, I mean, it's, what do we want? Do we want race riots? Do we want kind of unending conflict? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what happens now. It feels kind of like a febrile atmosphere online. I don't know how much that translates into the real world. Polling is very, very now it's the most anti-immigration it's ever been. I think Boris Johnson has kind of basically kind of turned up the heating on the kind of the frog being boiled like 10 degrees, and suddenly a lot of people are sort of very freaked out about it. And I suppose there's probably a little bit of buyer's remorse. It's like, okay, what have we done? What has been the benefit of all this? I don't know.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.